Hello, everyone. This is your host, Philip Reiner. I wanted to welcome you to The Fourth Leg. This is a series of podcasts focused on one of the most complex systems in the world today, nuclear command and control, and its increasingly complicated future. Within this series, we're going to go straight to the experts across multiple sectors to talk about the modernization of nuclear command and control systems. Keep an eye on technology for global security in the coming weeks and months as we begin to launch additional podcast series focused on how to fix the internet, AI and global security, and other critical technology and security related issues. For now, we have so much to talk about. Let's get started. For today's podcast, we are joined by our colleague Peter Hayes from the Nautilus Institute. We were fortunate to engage with Dr. Eric Grosse, the former Vice President for Security and Privacy Engineering at Google. Eric joined us recently to speak at greater length about what were some of the most compelling interventions during our workshop back in January, and the need for those who are considering how to build the 21st century architecture for NC3, as Eric puts it in his paper, how they ought to return to basics and harden small-scale systems. It is our pleasure to have them both here with us today. So Eric, it's really great to have you on the podcast today. Welcome. It's good to have you with us.
Thanks. Nice to join you.
So I thought what might be interesting at the outset is you've given us some real food for thought with the paper that you submitted and the conversations we had at the workshop back in January. But I thought what actually might be also of interest is, based off of your experience working at Google for all of those years and dealing with all of those large scale complex issues on the security front, was just interested in hearing from you a little bit about how you anticipated and tried to stay ahead of challenges at that scale while you were at Google, and staying ahead of the adversary. And obviously it has direct implications for what we're talking about when it comes to NC3. But just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on how you got ahead of that and stayed ahead of it over the years.
Okay, that is a challenge.
Yeah.
The fun part of security in some ways is you're always dealing with unexpected things. And so there's no way to really stay ahead of the adversary, but you can learn from the adversary. And that's certainly an important piece of this. That is much like an arms race or any competitive sports endeavor or something. You keep trying and you sometimes fail and you learn from that and get better. And so it's not a matter of staying ahead, but of at least not making the same mistakes multiple times. And that's about the best you can do. You can't, don't expect perfection.
Yeah.
That's what makes the NC3 problem especially interesting, because you can't afford to iterate in real life with some of those tools. So we have to rack our brains and figure out how we can learn from cases where we are able to do that iteration to stay ahead, so that when the crunch time comes and it really has to work in real life for the first time, learned from other things to improve your chances there.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we had discussed in the workshop to a certain extent, and then after the fact, which is of keen interest as Strategic Command considers how to go through the modernization process of NC3, how it thinks about digitization of some of its systems. That point of you don't really have that same opportunity to try things and to fail. We'll get into this a little bit in terms of some of the ideas that you put on the table in terms of trying to simplify things maybe a little bit. But
all that I would add to this is, in addition to just building it and seeing what breaks, you can be a little more proactive and think through as you're building it. Now, if I took a security mindset and thought about how an evil input could corrupt my intended software, you can do some of this checking of staying ahead of the attacker at the time you design it. And then after you've built it, either before or just as you've deployed it, you can get some of your friends around the organization to attack it.
Sure.
And that's both fun for them and educational for you. And then once you've done your due diligence that way, you can open it up to the world and say, we've built the system, we've tried hard to make it strong. We invite people to try to attack it and do it in a responsible way. That is, do your best. And then when you start to succeed, before you actually do any harm, tell us about it and we'll learn from that. And then finally, in the real world, you will have actual attackers. And so
Right.
be sure that you learn from them. And to the extent you can, share your experience with other people who might also be subject to those same attackers. And so, based on all of that, I think that's the way we try to stay ahead of the attacker.
Got it. And I think and I'll be totally candid, it's one of the things that I've had personally just a little bit of a hard time trying to wrap my head around how an organization as large as DoD, or even just those who are challenged to own and protect the nuclear enterprise and NC3 systems more broadly, is this idea of a more agile, responsive, flexible framework to do the types of things that you're describing that you would have been doing at Google. It's really hard for me to imagine them being able to adopt that sort of a responsiveness, if you will. Do you see that that's something that could actually be successfully integrated? And that may actually, more simply speak to a certain level of ignorance on my part, but it's really hard for me to imagine that sort of adaptability in such a large bureaucracy that's really built to focus on execution and not necessarily being 24/7 responsive.
Well, I don't have the personal military experience either, so I can't really speak
Yeah.
with authority here. But from what we read in the newspapers, it certainly seems like there are parts of the military that have a very agile attitude, and I'm thinking special forces, say. So
Sure.
it's not that it couldn't be done. I think the critical piece that military leaders would have to appreciate is this willingness to explore things and try working outside the normal rules and let people try things that fail
Hmm.
and accept that some amount of failure in the cyber area is to be expected, and not blame people and punish them severely for having failed, but as long as they're learning from these failures, that's a normal part of the operation. So that's the part that's perhaps the most important cultural change. You have to get this blameless culture brought in and give people the scope for doing that. And yes, I think that even a large organization with bureaucracy can learn to do that if they have the right leadership at the top.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and one that I think is of it's a real imperative at this point for DoD. I mean, the Defense Innovation Board has recently been talking a lot about overhauling its software acquisitions process, and it's really looking to commercial industry for examples of best practices. And it's really, my takeaway fundamentally is along the lines of what you were just describing, is it's not something that you can just import. It's a cultural shift that needs to take place with it as well. I think the culture at Google is one that really, maybe even from the outset, was willing to embrace that kind of thing. And so I guess the question would become, with a large organization like that that's fairly well entrenched, if you will, is it really possible to actually inculcate some new culture along those lines to really be able to embrace that sort of failure that's necessary?
Sure. And actually, I think red teams have been inside the defense industry for a long time doing this kind of work. I suppose the other important thing for senior leaders in the military would be to carefully looking at those red team events, understanding the lessons, and putting into their budget plan the necessary corrective measures. This is the thing that one often hears. Red teams inside a very bureaucratic organization, they run the test, they come back a year later and run the same exact playbook, and it still works. And that's what we would have to get around. So, but that's not a thing that a bureaucracy should not be able to cope with. After all, you write down your plan and you execute the plan. That's what a bureaucracy is good for. So, yes, I'm hopeful that this is something that should certainly work in the defense world.
Eric, the American NC3 system has, as we understand it, roughly 200 plus subsystems, some of which are legacy, some of which are sort of ultra modern, being superimposed on the legacy systems as we speak. And all of these systems have a communications component. And so it's really a global communication system which has many, many different parts and different functions. And looking at that total system, there are, in real nuclear war emergencies, a couple of moments, if you like, when you're at the brink of war, when communications really come into play. One is the role of early warning systems in picking up a pending attack against a state, where the operators need to talk to each other and then to their commanders. And then the other is the nuclear commanders talking amongst themselves, or the ability of operators to talk to their adversaries' operators, if such a channel exists, or the ability of a president to talk to an adversarial nuclear weapons state leader in a crisis to try and find a way out when their backs are up against the wall. I wonder, are there non-military emergency contexts where a really secure communication system could provide similar critically important and very time urgent communication services, where these operators or leaders could learn about such a system, that it works, that it's robust, it can't be spoofed or hacked, so that the learning about the reliability of that system and the trust in that system actually precedes the nuclear crisis, and they take it up, in essence, in the non-nuclear world in other emergencies. So it wouldn't be necessarily a system that's devoted to nuclear communications, but it might become the system that's actually relied on in real emergencies.
Yes, that's an excellent question. That's right at the heart of the way I view this problem. Classically, in the 60s, when these systems were first built, the civilian world did not have communication channels that had the confidentiality and integrity measures that one would need. So there was a clear distinction between military grade security and civilian grade security back then. But today, that's not so true. When a journalist is talking to a whistleblower, there's plenty of need for confidentiality and integrity, as seen by both sides there. And so there are already pretty strong systems for achieving that kind of security in the civilian world. As far as I know, they're now pretty secure. The difference might be that availability is still an issue today, just the way it was in the 60s. And if you're exploring things in the civilian world, you're in a somewhat more benign network environment in general. Now, that might not be true everywhere. If you were a civilian activist in some country about to go into civil war, it's quite likely that indeed even the basic ability to send packets from A to B may degrade. So I think there are chances to learn some of this, but what's striking is it's hard to play these things out with a really serious adversary who is prepared to do nation state level attacks, even on the availability part of this problem. So that's why it's so challenging. It's hard to see exactly what the best civilian analogy is. Certainly, when we look at natural disasters, hurricanes come through and so forth, those have traditionally taken out a lot of communication channels. And so you can learn something from FEMA or from amateur radio or whoever seems to be effective at keeping communications up, even in those natural disaster times? Yeah, you asked a great question.
Well, can I throw another curveball at you, which is, if you're dealing with nuclear armed adversaries that have ultimately a very lethal, even annihilative intention about each other in a real conflict, is it possible to even think about creating this kind of shared open source software in a cooperative manner? Or is it more that you would create the standard, the global best capacity using the software to create a secure communication suite, which they would adopt simply because it's the best? And that would then mean that everyone was endowed with that capability should they need it, not necessarily the United States. It might be India, Pakistan, or India, China, or all three of them, for example, in some kind of nuclear headlock where they need a really secure communication system. But could you envision an India and Pakistan cooperating to create that kind of software, or would they simply take it up because the United States generated in its own self-interest?
No, I think it's clear that India and Pakistan say do not want to just take the U.S. word for it. In fact, I observe that the countries that choose to be nuclear powers are almost by definition the ones who are prepared to spend a huge amount of their national assets because they don't take someone else's word for it. They feel that it's a national existential threat and they only can rely on themselves. So, of course, in that context, I think nuclear powers, but I think even the non nuclear powers are going to prefer to use a system for communication that they have their own ability to assess. They've contributed to it and they understand it well enough. They know its limitations, they know how to use it properly, and so forth. So, yes, I certainly expect whatever system is going to get widely deployed is going to need to be built in a global way, not built by somebody in the US and thrown over the wall. Now, there's another interesting element of this question you asked about operators of adversaries being able to talk to each other, say India and Pakistan. I think that would be very valuable. There's chances to prevent mistakes that could have catastrophic consequences if that misunderstanding wasn't cleared up. So I think that would be very good. But there are also government concerns with creating channels of great communication between the cross organizational boundaries or even national boundaries. And so I can understand that at least initially there would be some reluctance in some places in the world to create those channels. So I think a good way to get started is in that mode you're describing, where even, say, within India, different units have some assurance of being able to talk to each other, because there can be misunderstandings even within a single country. So it's good to build that system even from the perspective of just one country. What makes it hard? I mean, we already have communication channels. Those are already up, right? People already use telephones and radios and chat systems and so forth.
Yeah.
One of the things that's making it hard in this context of multiple organizations, and even more in the context of multiple countries, is agreeing in advance on how people that normally don't communicate very much can choose to communicate in times of emergency. And the best way to do that, of course, is to prepare ahead of time. Just like we tell people to back up their computers, well, you should have some backup communication channels already there. And if that means agreeing in advance on the protocols to be used, the formats, how to find the public keys, etc., that's something that should be done before the crisis comes so that it's ready to be used when needed. Hope that helps a little, Peter, on your broad question. What's challenging about the technology to be used here? And I would say the big theme of my essay is complexity is the enemy of security.
Yeah.
And that's been true for a long time. And it's not that complexity is sort of a thing that breaks everything. So we build lots of complex systems and they're reasonably secure. But specifically for the communication channels with nuclear command and control, and similarly with some civilian channels that are expected to withstand very advanced adversaries, we do need to have a higher level of achieved security than we are getting today with these complex systems. Just last week, we saw a blizzard of vulnerability announcements with the corresponding patches from the software vendors. I mean, just astonishing. Some people looking at that said, my goodness, how does any of our infrastructure even stay alive? It's amazing. And I think the answer is we know how to muddle through with these very complex systems we've built. And that is fine in times of peace. But the idea of muddling through in times of nuclear war is not a good strategy. And so I'm advocating for building a few very simple systems that are so small we can afford to use methods that get us a much higher level of reliability and security than we can get out of complex systems. That won't be true across the board. So you mentioned the defense industry and the large number of systems, even in nuclear command and control, sensor fusion from all these early warning systems, et cetera. I believe the whole NC3 problem on that scale is inherently complex and the solutions are inherently complex. But for the specific communication channel, operator talking to operator or general talking to a captain out in the field, those seem like problems to me, naively, that could be solved with a much simpler system. And that with that simplicity, we have a better chance of making it so robust that when it's needed in a nuclear war, it will actually work. So that's what I'm excited by in this problem. I think that fits in with other things that the people in the security industry would like to work on. There's good technology that hasn't been a natural thing coming up broadly in the civilian world. So here's a special opportunity as part of NC3 modernization, not for the whole part of it, but for a piece of NC3 modernization to do something really interesting.
To go back a little bit to Peter's question with that in mind, trying to think about it from a global perspective and building that more simplistic capability. I think one of the responses that we hear back from those who may be deeply embedded within the DoD edifice is, simple actually creates too many vulnerabilities. Simplicity is not really an option for us, and there within complexity is actually beneficial. Curious as to your thoughts as to that juxtaposition, but also more to Peter's question on another level is how do you picture different countries coming together and potentially working on this, and how do you actually motivate the right level of trust so that they feel inclined to be a part of such a project, to work on it together towards an end where the comms may actually work at the moment of such a catastrophic event.
Right. Well, the people you speak with are about the constant force that tends toward greater complexity are certainly right. I appreciate that. Been involved in some pretty complex systems myself, so I see how that tends to evolve.
Sure.
I think that it's an unproven claim then that we can build a very simple system that would be useful here. But we're not talking about any exclusive approach. The right way to get resiliency sometimes is redundancy. So we're not saying they can't also build a complex system. We're saying let's have a very simple system that's there alongside and ready to fall back on when the complicated system breaks. And so I think it's worth trying this approach and seeing how it goes. We talk about the red teams. So let's field both systems, the complicated and the simple, and let the red teams attack both of them, and let's see what happens.
Yeah.
And so that would be my rather pragmatic answer to the people that say it can't be done. Let's try building both and see how it turns out.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. It also reminds me of a previous conversation that we had that I was interested in following up with you on, when we talked about how to actually begin to think about what that simple system might look like, and that there's a lot of existent software that may just need to kind of be relegated to the side for the time being. They may be really just focusing on building something novel from the bottom up. I was just curious as to hearing a little bit more from you as to the actual tangible technical elements of what something like this might begin to. Where would you start? What does it actually begin to look like? And as we had discussed it before, do we really need to bulldoze all of the existing software off the cliff and start over, or is there stuff off the shelf that could still be useful?
Right. I don't think that we have to bulldoze for sure. This is definitely one of selecting from a large collection of existing working pieces that have already been shown to survive in a hostile environment. So that part, fortunately, we're not starting from scratch. I think also to get to this issue of global trust, the system we're talking about has to be open source so that everyone who's skeptical can look at it and try to look for backdoors or flaws. Even within open source, there are a lot of already existing excellent pieces that can be assembled. So yes, as you say, the way to get to simpler is not to bulldoze it, start from a clean slate, and try to build up from there. I think the way to get to simpler is to start from a working system that does just this minimal task that we define and prune down all of the pieces, keep cutting away all of the pieces that are there but not needed for that functionality. And I think we can get it way down. And many orders of magnitude fewer lines of code in this final system. And that's what I'm looking for. Now, another way you get simplicity is not just to prune things out, but to think hard about what's left and see how something that's done similarly, but 4 or 5 different ways, if you think really hard, you may figure out one way to achieve all 4 or 5 of those and consolidate as well as just pruning. So I don't want to underestimate the amount of effort required here. This is still quite a challenge, but it's not a challenge in the sense of starting from scratch.
Well, Eric, in the NC3 world, with the 9 nuclear weapons states, there are currently not even agreement about what standards should look like. There's no consensus about a norm, about what kind of performance levels, what kinds of systems, whether and how they should be protected or not. So I wonder, where literally is the place to start? Do you start at that level to try and get them to specify some domains, some applications, and then create a tool that would actually be useful to at least one of those players, and the others may take it up as a result? Or do you start, with global disaster response, of which there are any number of candidates on a given day in need of secure communications, and you bring together the market players and perhaps the thousands of leaders and actors around the world who have to respond to existing global disasters. The 25,000 odd cities we have on the planet, they all have probably a disaster response unit with a need for a simple, extremely robust and highly secure comm suite. Do you take the market and those kinds of civil society driven needs as the starting point? Or do you think, on the military itself and within the military, the nuclear military, to see if we can get their attention?
Well, sure, wherever it works. But one of the lessons for me out of our workshop was, even if our end goal is communications for nuclear command and control, it's a good idea in terms of this global development of software to pick a problem that's not of interest only to the nuclear weapon states. There are other nations that are not nuclear, and we don't want to give them an incentive to go nuclear. So in the interest of nonproliferation, let's keep this a broad-based effort And the way to do that, I think, is to view it in this prospect of creating a hotline between national leaders. That's a topic that everyone can agree would be important. And we need those channels even between nations that perhaps are so adversarial they don't even have diplomatic relations. We still want them to be able to talk. And because of the level, those channels are going to be attacked by other nations' militaries. So it is, to me, inherently a somewhat military prospect. You expect the militaries to need to be participants in this because they often have the most capable offensive capabilities. I'm talking now about cyber command and so forth. That's why I think it's good that the military participate, but many of the people building the system do not have to be military or even in the defense industry. This can be civil society building these tools. So I think that's the prospect for how it could play out, that we try to find a problem like national leaders talking to each other, that inherently the solution needs to be so open that two countries that don't trust each other can each agree on using one piece of software. That's a challenge, but I think by solving that particular problem, it shows that it's inherent that we need to agree. And so I think we could get the military to agree to try to attack the software, and we could get civil society to also agree to review the software and see that it can't be used for other things than communication. So that's the prospect.
That's one of the things that I have actually thought about since hearing your original proposal, Eric, has been this intriguing element of it. On one level, how do you convince those who are in DoD, for example, to consider the possibility of adopting something like an open sourced comms capability for NC3? But also, how do you, from the other side of the equation, trying to envision a scenario where folks who are building something like this out in civil society, perhaps even, would be interested in working with the military on building something like this? And I think you make a very intriguing case as to why that would be of use. It's a question that kind of hangs out there, obviously, with a lot of some of the other noise that's in the system in terms of folks who are inclined or disinclined to work with the military per se. Just curious as to your thoughts, maybe a little bit further to pull that thread on, yeah, engendering that sort of collaboration, cooperation when there's maybe potentially some reticence.
Sure, it's natural. There's reticence. In fact, I mean, this is almost boggles the mind. Why is this not a just completely crazy idea? How could anybody accept this? So,
Yeah.
I mean, the normal military mission would be to break into systems like the ones we're talking about.
Right, right.
So why on earth would the military cooperate with building one they can't break into? It does seem counterintuitive. I agree. Here's my argument. If you think of your adversary having let's say, some nuclear tip missiles and a national leader who has a big red button on his desk, as long as that leader is confident when the button is pushed, the missiles will launch. Then he will wait on pushing the button until he thinks it's time that he has to launch an attack. If he's worried that when he pushes the button, the adversary's military may have cut off the button and it won't be connected to the missile anymore, then he's motivated as soon as tensions start to rise. Well before he was actually ready to launch, he may have to delegate authority to launch out to the field, out to some military leader right at the missile base, and say, if we lose communications, you're authorized to launch. That, to me, is an inherently more dangerous world to live in than one where the decision to launch resides at that one big desk. And so it's even in the U.S. national interest for that adversary to have a reliable channel there. That's my argument. And I look forward to debating that some more with the people who actually have the responsibility and see if there's something I'm missing. But that's why it makes sense to me. Now, there are other audiences. So you mentioned, well, what about the people who are very bright at building software and building secure software, but do not approve of some way in which their military is doing something? I think the thing that I learned over some years at Google, dealing with various governments trying to break in, and various governments also wanting to partner with us to do something worthwhile that we would agree is worthwhile. I think what I learned over time is you don't have people who are just partners or people who are just adversaries. You don't have countries or organizations the size of a military that think with a single mind. So you have to have this more mature attitude towards the complexity of people and organizations, that you will agree to partner with people on some parts of a problem while realizing they remain your bitter adversary on other problems. And so as long as you can work that out, it's a form of trust but verify, to go back to the early 80s. You agree to work on some things as long as you can see that that joint work can step by step be checked so that it doesn't cause you harm. And I think this is a case where we're in that situation by jointly developing some open source that fills a function, and by both sides agreeing to use it. That seems like the right incentives are in place.
Eric, is there a parallel in the drone world? I understand that DoD recently adopted an open source drone software to run DoD's drones. Is that actually a clear parallel in the military dimension?
Interesting. I don't know enough about that to really give you a good answer there, but it's something I'd like to read more about.
Yeah, because I know that in the commercial and civil society drone world, that it's an open source software that's now used to run drones. I think there are a couple of million users now around the world. But I think it was only about 2 weeks ago that DoD announced that move itself. Well, I have sort of one final question that I wanted to ask, which is, how this kind of software might be our salvation in really dire straits. I mean, we're appropriately focused on trying to avoid at all costs almost actually having to fight a nuclear war. And that's what communications in the systems that nuclear weapon states have are primarily dedicated to doing. But if you do end up in a nuclear war, one of the critical questions about communications is whether it's possible to communicate stop firing to your forces at the time when you decide that you've either lost or need to stop fighting because you won or you're just exhausted. And the question is whether this kind of secure capacity could actually help us end a nuclear war, God forbid one ever starts, and actually save the species from self-imposed annihilation and extermination.
Well, that would be great. Yes. I think inherent in what we're talking about is enough authentication that when you gave the command stop firing, the people would believe it's really coming from you. So I think that part of the problem we would have solved if we got somewhere here. I think the prospect of communication channels, just the bandwidth, just the bits getting from A to B, still working in the context of deep into a nuclear war, that's a pretty tough problem. I think it would be worth trying to build something of that sort, but that's hard. We do have people that try to, I mentioned amateur radio, right? That's their motto is always, when everything else is broken down, all you need is this piece of old-fashioned electronics, fairly large scale compared to modern computers, and a wire up in the trees, and you can still send small messages. So I would hope that whatever communication system we build be robust in that sense. As long as there's some way to get messages from A to B, you can still get a secure message.
Yeah, I mean, the ones that really worry me are the submarine commanders who are stuck out in the middle of the ocean underwater and don't know what's happened on land. And so, as you say, all the long distance communication systems that they might rely on may have been nuked or fried, or no one there any longer to communicate via those channels. But you can imagine, I think, situations where those who are running a really secure communications system could actually have rapidly deployable emergency links. For example, you could fire low Earth orbit satellite devices that might be deployed specifically to combine with the software to get a message to a commander pretty much anywhere on the planet within 30 minutes.
Yeah, sounds like a good idea. I'm agnostic with regard to what technology is used for that communication, but it just sounds to me like HF radio with wires and trees is more resilient than launching satellites, right? A lot less. Individuals can carry with their own hands the amount of technology it needs to send a message to a submarine if the submarine can come towards the surface and trail along wire.
Yeah, that's true. That the atmosphere can be extremely perturbed for single sideband radio frequencies when there are nuclear explosions going off. So, it's something one would really have to sit down and do the design work. But it may be that the challenge is less demanding than it might appear, even in the most extreme circumstances. But if you don't do the preparation and deploy the capacities and test them, it won't be there when you need it.
Yes, totally agree with you.
Which is exactly why we're going to be having this additional workshop coming up in October to try to pull this thread a little bit further. As these systems get even more complex, as we introduce some more advanced technologies that really we've never seen integrated into these decision-making systems, much less these communication systems, it's even harder to understand what the potential vulnerabilities might be that we're creating as we go down this path. Not just the human fallibility, right, but introducing some of these machine fallibilities as well.
Right. So redundancy is the way you get some better resiliency. And part of the hard part of redundancy is making sure that your plan B does not somehow depend on plan A. and that's why we need smart people working on this.
Which is quite literally why I'm talking to you. I really can't thank you enough, Eric, for being with us for the podcast here today. But I think even more importantly for contributing to the discussion to date, the workshop in January through your paper. We look forward to getting this paper out into as many hands as possible and continuing the discussion with you. I think this is actually one of the more intriguing elements of what we've been talking about to date. And I think it's really an incredibly worthwhile line of inquiry that we really need to push on. So really, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having organized that workshop last January. It was great fun to have people from so many different areas coming together on a focused topic like this. You get people that work in security together with people that drive submarines. It's just been fascinating and very enjoyable. So thank you.
And thanks to you, Eric, for your years of contributions to this field and for this provocative discussion. Thanks again for joining us today. For our listeners, stay tuned. We'll be back next week with a new episode of The Fourth Leg. Hit us up on Twitter, subscribe to the pod via SoundCloud, sign up for more Tech4GS information via the website, or just shoot us a note via email at info@tech4gs.org. Until then, thanks to everyone for listening. We look forward to hearing more of your comments and feedback.